But we've already had a look at the opening to Paul's letters. It's an opening to Paul's letter to the Romans. It's an elaborate opening, in part because this is a letter Paul has written to a group he has never visited. He's never been to Rome. He's never visited the physical setting of the Christians who are there. He knows a lot of the Christians there. You can tell that from chapter 16. In fact, he has some really good Christian co-workers that are now located in Rome, including Priscilla and Aquila, that he knows quite well. But he's never been there. And so he begins the letter very carefully, since he's talking to a lot of people that don't really know who he is and probably wonder who he is. Paul says at a couple of places in Romans that there are some rumors circulating that are not true about him. Have you ever had rumors circulate about you as a pastor that are not true? Take heart. That happens to every pastor, and it certainly happened to Paul. He says in chapter 3, verse 8, why not do evil that good may come? He's a proclaimer of God's grace, and so some people have said about Paul that he proclaims God's grace so fully and richly that he argues that we should do evil that good may come. And then he says in 3:8, as some people slanderously charge us with saying, their condemnation is just. There are a couple of other places in Romans, for example in 6:1, where Paul asks the rhetorical question, what shall we say then? Are we to continue in sin that grace may abound? Or 6:15, what then? Are we to sin because we are not under the law, but under grace? Where it's pretty clear that rumors have circulated about Paul all over that are incorrect. And one of the reasons Paul wants to open this letter at such great length and so carefully is that he knows he's speaking to a wide cross-section of people, some of whom, like Priscilla and Aquila, are his wonderful co-workers and know exactly who he is. Others of whom have been misinformed about who he is, and others who probably don't know him at all. And yet God has called him to exercise his apostolic and pastoral authority within this community. And so it's not an option not to write this pastoral letter to the Romans. God's called him to serve this community. And so he opens in the way we saw just a minute ago. And then in chapter 1, verses 16 to 17, he summarizes the gospel that he's going to teach in this letter. You'll notice that chapter 1, verse 16 begins with a for. That for is a really important little connecting advice all through the letter. Whenever you see a for in Romans, it's worth looking carefully at what it's connecting to. And sometimes the headings in our English Bibles, even in our Greek Bibles, interfere with looking at the connections. But the connection here is particularly important. Paul says, so I am eager to preach the gospel to you who are in Rome, this cross-section of Greeks and barbarians, wise and foolish, because I am not ashamed of the gospel. What does Paul mean by being ashamed here? I'm not ashamed of the gospel. I think there are probably a couple of things he means. I think he's got two things in mind. One is that Rome was just this magnificent city, where as a Roman citizen it would have been very tempting for Paul to focus on all the magnificence, all the marble and all the gold and all the luxury that was in the central part of Rome, in the Roman Forum, that just took people's breath away who visited it. And there might have been a temptation on Paul's part, especially since the gospel was not just for the people that inhabited the ivory and gold towers of the Roman Forum, but also because the gospel was for people who lived across the Tiber River, where there were leather tanning operations that used the sewers of Rome to tan the leather, and stank terribly. This is where the Jewish population lived and worked, on the docks of the Tiber, in warehouses, and in the leather tanning factories with their vast vats of human urine, to be quite honest and straightforward about it. That's actually where most of the Christians in Rome were located. So it might have been very tempting for Paul to arrive in Rome and kind of sneak through the really nice sections as a Roman citizen and kind of secretly visit the down and out sections where many of the Roman Christians lived, and to be sort of ashamed. But he's not. And he wants to make that point very clearly here at the beginning. I am not ashamed of the gospel. So that's one reason that Paul might have been tempted to be ashamed, and that he asserts he is not ashamed. The gospel is for absolutely everybody, sophisticated, highly educated people, and people that are uneducated, the barbarians that work across the river, don't speak Latin, and are really the immigrant population from the East. It's for everybody, and Paul's not ashamed of it. So the second reason I think that Paul says he's not ashamed of the gospel here, and it has to do with something Paul says in Romans 8. If you'll go with me for just a moment to Romans 8. Romans 8 is this glorious chapter. I'm going to get to it in a little bit. And it has one very clear quotation from the Old Testament. And it's toward the end of Romans 8 where Paul asks the question in verses 35 and 36, who shall separate us from the love of Christ? Shall tribulation or distress or persecution or famine or nakedness or danger or sword? As it is written, for your sake we are being killed all the day long. We are regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. That's from Psalm 44. It's worth going back to Psalm 44 for just a minute to look at the wider context of that quotation. Let's go back to Psalm 44. This is a long psalm. We don't have time to read it all. But basically, it's a psalm that reminds God that he's done so many good things for God's people in the past. And the psalmist is very grateful for that. But he says now, recently, in the present, even though God's people don't seem to have done anything particularly horrible in rebellion against him, in fact, this seems to be a more righteous and obedient part of Israel's history, God's people nevertheless are being persecuted terribly, and they're being slaughtered. He says, the psalmist says in verse 17, all this has come upon us, though we have not forgotten you. And we have not been false to your covenant. Our heart has not turned back, nor have our steps departed from your way. Yet you have broken us in the place of jackals and covered us with the shadow of death. If we had forgotten the name of our God or spread out our hands to a foreign god, would not God discover this? For he knows the secrets of the heart. In other words, Lord, you know our hearts down deep. You know we haven't been false and rebelled against you. Yet for your sake we are killed all the day long. We're regarded as sheep to be slaughtered. Look at verse 23. Awake, the psalmist is saying, Lord, it's like you're asleep. Wake up. Why are you sleeping, O Lord? Rouse yourself. Do not reject us forever. Why do you hide your face? Why do you forget our affliction and oppression? For our soul is bowed down to the dust. Our belly clings to the ground. Rise up. Come to our help. Redeem us for the sake of your steadfast love. The temptation of the psalmist in this psalm, he hasn't caved into it yet, but he's on the cusp of it, is to be ashamed of God, who has not been faithful to his people. He's not, he's not there yet. He's not an apostate, but he does not understand. In Romans 8, on the other end of Paul's full explanation of the gospel of God's grace, is the answer to Psalm 44. It is Paul saying, we don't have all the answers yet to the suffering that we experience, but we have more of them now than the psalmist did. And that's a wonderful blessing. We know because Christ, through his death on the cross and his resurrection, has shown us that we will not be separated from the love of God. So Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. I'm more confident, Paul says, than I have ever been, or than God's people perhaps ever could be in the past, that God is going to be faithful to his promises to his people. So I think for those two reasons, Paul says, I am not ashamed of the gospel. It's for everybody. And it shows that God doesn't say one thing and do another. He doesn't give up on his people. Paul goes on to explain this in very brief compass in verses 16 and 17. Verses 16 and 17 are the thesis statement of Romans. Pretty much everything else in the letter is an unpacking of verses 16 and 17. For I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for it is the power of God for salvation to everyone who believes, to the Jew first, and also to the Greek. For in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith, for faith, as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. Here Paul says that the gospel is, first of all, the power of God. Secondly, that it is the power of God for salvation. And thirdly, and once again, so that we are sure not to forget it, that it is for absolutely everyone. And he says with another 4 in verse 17, that the reason he can describe the gospel this way is that the righteousness of God is revealed in the gospel. What he means by righteousness is the power of God for salvation. The righteousness of God is the power of God for salvation. And the righteousness of God is from faith for faith. For as it is written, the righteous shall live by faith. So God's power for salvation is revealed in his righteousness. And the fact that this power for salvation and God's righteousness is for absolutely everyone is revealed in the fact that it comes to us by faith. If it didn't come to us by faith, at God's initiative, it wouldn't be for everyone. It would be for certain favored groups, like perhaps the Jews who had the Mosaic law, and who may have thought we can do the law, whereas others can't. So God's righteousness, his power, and his salvation are all for us, not necessarily for anyone else who's outside the hearing of the Mosaic law. And Paul wants to make the point, no, because salvation comes by faith, because the power of God comes to anyone who believes the gospel and relies on God for salvation, it's for absolutely everyone, because absolutely anyone can trust God for salvation. So let's look more closely at what this phrase, the righteousness of God, means here. What is the meaning of this phrase? We've already said it refers to the power of God and the salvation of God, because Paul parallels the righteousness of God in verse 17 with the power of God for salvation in verse 16. You can also tell that it means the power of God for salvation if you look back at a psalm that Paul is pretty clearly alluding to here, Psalm 98. Let's go back to Psalm 98 for just a moment. This is a beautiful psalm. Paul probably knew it by heart, just as many of us are familiar with it today. And it talks about the righteousness of God and what it is. Psalm 98, verse 1, "O sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things." Did I say 91? This is 98:1. Yeah. "O sing to the Lord a new song, for he has done marvelous things. His right hand and his holy arm have worked salvation for him. The Lord has made known his salvation. He has revealed his righteousness in the sight of the nations." You see how salvation and righteousness are parallel to each other there? They're self-defining. "He has remembered his steadfast love and faithfulness to the house of Israel." And then just like Paul says in verse 17, "All the ends of the earth have seen the salvation of our God." So God's powerful salvation is something that encompasses or includes, or is in the view of, all the ends of the earth. Paul's pretty clearly alluding to that here. So the righteousness of God is clearly the saving power of God. But there's another element to the righteousness of God that Paul brings out as the argument of Romans unfolds. And the second element that he brings out very clearly in the next couple of paragraphs in chapter 1, verses 18 to 32, is that the righteousness of God refers to the fairness of God. The word righteousness in the Greek of Paul's time would have been understood by many people in terms of equity, being fair, doing what's right and just. I've got a coin here that I'm going to pass around. This is one of my favorite possessions, actually. My son Jonathan got this for me for a birthday gift because I had explained to Jonathan what the righteousness of God was and how on this Roman coin from AD 62, the word righteousness appears on the outside around the rim, and then on the iconography on the back, the stamp on the back shows the goddess righteousness holding a set of scales that are evenly balanced. And this was a coin minted in the time of Nero. I'm going to pass it around so you can look at it, and you'll see Nero's bust on one side. So Paul wrote Romans 5 years before this coin was minted. It was minted in Alexandria, Egypt, and the same emperor was the emperor when Paul wrote Romans. It was Nero who minted this coin. And Nero was trying to get across to his people the propaganda, which was definitely not true, but he was trying to get across to his people that he was a very fair and just emperor, especially when it came to the distribution of bread among the people, the citizens of Rome. And so he had these minted in Alexandria, which was kind of the breadbasket of the Roman Empire, but they would have circulated all around the Roman Empire, carrying this message that the Emperor Nero is a fair emperor. He's just like Dikaiosune, the goddess of righteousness, has these scales and they're evenly balanced, so he evenly distributes bread to the people of Rome. In other words, a lot of people would have had coins like this jingling around in their pockets in Rome. They would have slapped this down to get their hummus or their bread, or they would have pulled it out of their leather coin bags to pay their rent at the beginning of the month. And Dikaiosune was stamped on this coin. This is what people in Rome would have understood Dikaiosune, righteousness, to mean. And when they heard Paul talking about the righteousness of God that is revealed in the gospel, their first thought would have been, well, God is fair. He's a just equitable God. He does what's fair and right by people. So let me pass this around so you can have a look at it. Don't be afraid of hurting it. It's a pretty substantial coin. It's not, by the way, a particularly rare coin, which is why Jonathan was able to get hold of it. He got it on the internet, but it's a genuine one. It's not a fake one, and it comes from AD 62. But I would like it back. It's back there. Thanks. So you can see that in what follows in Romans 1:18 to 32, as Paul explains the gospel, he opens with a demonstration of God's righteousness in showing his wrath, that God is fair. That's part of what Paul wants to say in 1:18 to 32, that when God pours out his wrath on people, he's absolutely fair in doing that. There's nothing unfair about the God who pours out his wrath on sinners. And not only are the people on whom he pours out his wrath deserving of his wrath, but God pours out his wrath itself. The actual action of punishing the people who are under his wrath is very fair, very equitable. You can see that just to take one example in verses 28 and 29. Since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. So they didn't see fit, even though God had made very clear to them who he was and that he ought to be acknowledged and thanked for his good gifts to them. They, in their rebellion, just blew God off. They didn't care one thing about that. They did that, first of all, in their mind, and then what they thought with their mind affected their actions. And so God, in his equity, in his dikaiosune, in his righteousness, in his evenness, he gave them up to a debased mind. He didn't go any further in his punishment of them than exactly what was just, given how they had treated him. That's part of Paul's point. God is an absolutely just God in showing his wrath. So part of what Paul wants to say when he uses this phrase so often in Romans, the righteousness of God, is not just that God is a powerful God who uses his power to save his people, but that he is also a fair and just God who, when he punishes people, does so fairly and justly. But there is a third thing that Paul wants to say by the use of this phrase, the righteousness of God, and it is that God is a God who releases sinners who, in all fairness, deserve his punishment. He releases them from that punishment at great sacrifice to himself. Paul also uses the phrase, the righteousness of God, to mean that whole complex series of events based on God's merciful character. And he brings that out in chapter 3, verses 21 to 26. But now the righteousness of God has been manifested apart from the law, though the law and the prophets bear witness to it. The righteousness of God through faith in Jesus Christ for all who believe. For there is no distinction, for all have sinned and fall short of the glory of God, and are justified by his grace as a gift through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom God put forward as a propitiation by his blood, to be received by faith. This was to show God's righteousness, because in his divine forbearance he had passed over former sins. It was to show his righteousness at the present time, so that he might be righteous, or just, so that he might be fair and equitable, and at the same time the justifier, the one who acquits, the one who releases from punishment those who have faith in Jesus. So part of what Paul is doing in Romans is showing how God in his righteousness saves people, saves his people. But he does this in a way that preserves his fairness. And he does it in a way that shows his great grace and love and his willingness to expend himself on behalf of his people. The righteousness of God is a very important phrase then in Romans because it really kind of encapsulates the gospel. All right, well, let's look at this third and final part of Romans 1:16 and 17. Paul says in 1:17, "For in the gospel the righteousness of God is revealed from faith for faith, as it is written, the righteous," my ESV says, "shall live by faith." If you've got an ESV, and this is probably true of some other translations as well, you can see that down at the bottom of the page, at least in the ESV, there's a little footnote. And it tells us that this quotation from Habakkuk 2:4 can be translated a different way as well. It can be translated, "The one who by faith is righteous shall live." So it all depends on where you put that little phrase, "by faith." Does it go with the righteous by faith shall live? Or does it go with shall live? The righteous shall live by faith. It does make a difference where you put that little phrase. Because if it goes with the righteous by faith shall live, Paul's referring to the way we become righteous in God's sight, to the righteousness that God gives to us. That happens by faith. And he's saying that the righteous by faith are those who will live. If he says the righteous shall live by faith, then he's not really saying anything about how we become righteous. He's just assuming a body of righteous people, and he's saying they're going to live by faith. Now, that could mean that they're going to live on the final day of judgment when God holds them accountable. They're going to live on that day by their faith in Jesus. Or it could mean that the righteous, who Paul we know is going to say later in Romans are righteous by faith alone, that they live lives that are characterized by faith. They don't just start the journey of the Christian life by faith, but they live by faith as well. I actually think that the footnote in the ESV has got this right, not the main text. That what Paul is saying here is that the righteous by faith shall live. The reason for that is that it just has to do with the way the grammar is set up there, the details of the grammar. But Paul, I think, is saying that we become righteous by faith. And then he is saying those who are righteous by faith will live. And he's actually providing for us here a little outline of the first 8 chapters of the book of Romans. This is an insight not at all original with me. It comes from Charles E.B. Cranfield, who's written a wonderful 2-volume commentary on Paul's letter to the Romans. And he says chapters 1 through 4 describe what it means to be righteous by faith. And chapters 5 through 8 describe what it means to live as one who has been made righteous by faith. So chapters 1 to 4 really talk about primarily, how we become righteous. That happens by faith. How does that work? How can God be both just and the justifier of sinners? That happens by faith. And by faith, in particular, in what God has done through Christ Jesus. And then in chapters 5 through 8, he talks about how those who are justified by faith will live. And if you look at the vocabulary of chapters 5 through 8, the words, the verb live and the noun life show up over and over and over again in chapters 5 through 8. They are all about having life. Having been justified, therefore, by faith, Paul begins 5:1, we have peace with God. So I think Cranfield is right there. And in this quotation of Habakkuk 2:4, Paul's giving us a little outline of Romans 1 through 8. He's telling us what he's going to say, what he's going to describe in 1 to 4 is how we are righteous by faith, and in 5 to 8, how those who are righteous by faith shall live. All right, let's then dive into, after this preface, let's dive into 1:18 to 4:25 and see how far we can get. We've already talked a little bit about 1:18 to 32. So in 1:18 to 32, Paul is going to begin describing the wrath of God. He says, "For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of human beings who by their unrighteousness suppress the truth." That kind of states the thesis of 1:18 all the way down to 3:20. This next major section of Romans, where Paul is going to be describing the wrath of God revealed against all ungodliness and righteousness of human beings. Paul begins with a 4. And remember, we said we need to always notice these 4s when they show up. That 4 is a particularly important one. For the wrath of God is revealed. It attaches verse 18 to the end of verse 17 to the quotation from Habakkuk 2:4, the righteous shall live, or the righteous by faith shall live. Why is it that the righteous by faith shall live, and that only the righteous by faith will live? Well, because it's impossible to be righteous any other way than by faith. And in fact, the wrath of God is poured out on all those who are not righteous by faith. The righteous by faith shall live because the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of human beings. And as Paul's going to make the point so clear in 1:18 to 3:20, that covers absolutely everybody. So the only way to be righteous is by faith, and only the righteous will live. Others fall under the wrath of God. That 4 then is very important. So Paul's going to make basically 4 points in this next section from 1:18 to 3:20. His first point is that God's condemnation of sinful humanity is absolutely just and fair. We've already talked about that, so we won't have to go into a lot of detail here. But Paul says, first of all, that God revealed himself to humanity as their creator. He revealed that in creation itself. Their response was not to thank him for his creation, but to reject him, and instead of worshiping him as the creator, to worship what he had created. And look at how Paul describes their worship of what God created in verse 23. They exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal human beings and birds and animals and reptiles. Do you notice how we kind of move incrementally from high to low there? So they should have been worshiping the immortal God, who it was very clear created them. But instead, they just moved incrementally one step down. They moved the crowning jewel of God's creation, human beings themselves. And that's kind of what happens, isn't it? If you sort of look at how people that have refused to acknowledge God think they typically, if they're moral people at all, they typically become, once they've rejected God and don't want to have anything to do with God, they become humanists. And they're often at that level, moral people who support good causes. They don't have much of a good reason for doing that. I mean, if there is no God, then what is the difference between Mother Teresa and Adolf Hitler anyway? If we're all just sort of molecules swimming around. But nevertheless, and somewhat irrationally, they continue to be very moral people and are humanists. They worship human beings, and often their goal in life is to sort of perpetuate the human race or to perpetuate goodness among human beings and so on and so forth. But Paul, I think, hints that, things never stay there. Once we've exchanged the glory of the immortal God for his creatures as our objects of worship, we don't just stop with worshiping man. Before long, we start worshiping the birds of the heavens, the animals, and in Greek, these are the four-footed animals, so cows. And then eventually, we just get right down in the mud with the salamanders and the alligators. He's describing really kind of the worship of the Egyptians, the ancient Egyptians. They did worship reptiles and four-footed creatures like the calf or the cow or the bull. And they worshipped the Pharaoh, of course, was considered a god. So I think he's kind of got Egyptian worship in mind, but there is something very sort of wise and theologically astute also just about how the worship goes sort of incrementally down once we take our eyes off of God. And then 3 times in this passage, in verse 24, and then in verse 26, and then again in verse 28, like the tolling of a bell, Paul says that God gives people over to the rebellion that they have chosen. He's perfectly just in doing this. He's giving people what they want. So verse 24, God gave them up in the lusts of their hearts to impurity. Verse 26, God gave them up to dishonorable passions. Verse 28, they did not see fit to acknowledge God, and God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. And what Paul indicates at the end here in verses 30 to 32, with this very rhetorically sophisticated list of horrors, is just to show us what the end result of all this is. The end result of taking our eyes off God and placing them instead on his creatures and refusing him the worship that is his due is social mayhem and chaos. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's decree that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. So there comes a point where they even realize that they are working for their own destruction and the destruction of humanity. But in their greed, they not only continue to do these things, but they approve of those who do them. And if we're honest with ourselves and honest before our newspapers and newscasts every night, this is an exact description of the way the world functions, isn't it? When we take our eyes off God, we end up with a society that is kind of like the society we live in. And I think this should not discourage us. As ministers of the gospel, it should energize us. And I think it energized Paul. This is why we're here. This is what God is calling us to do. To take the mask off this lie of that human beings can flourish without acknowledging their Creator. We need to unmask that lie and to show the goodness and graciousness and love and mercy of God in the gospel, and that it is all about human flourishing, so that the gospel is the antidote to what we see here. And Paul's going to make that point real clearly in chapter 12, verses 1 to 2, where you find a kind of a reversal of what goes on here in 1:18 to 32. On the other side of acknowledging God in the gospel, our minds begin to be transformed. You notice how the mind is so important here. It's the mind that leads people astray. But then in 12:1 to 2, it's the mind that is transformed and then leads to this wonderful, loving community of people who in humility and service support one another and work for their flourishing and their good.